Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Church of Christ, and I teach theology. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today, we're going to do a general overview of Lumen Gentium, Chapter 8, an interview with Deacon Dr. Mark Miravalle. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican or frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. So just to give you a perspective like we do when we do these introductions, Vatican II has all these different documents. We're going through them in the podcast in chronological order. Lumen Gentium, right, means light to the people or light to the Gentiles. And we did chapters 1 through 7, which is really more about the church, about ecclesiology. We did an interview with Dr. Sean Blanchard a little over a month ago, I think about a month ago. Right now, today we're going to focus on chapter 8, which is on Mary as mother of the church, which is a slightly different thing. In Vatican II, there was a debate whether to make it a separate document. That was one of the closest debates in the entire council. So when I went through it, I said, hey, I'll get a Mary expert for this one. I'll get an expert on ecclesiology on the church for 1 through 7. So a little bit about our guest, Dr. Mark, today. Thank you for being here.
Surely.
He's the St. John Paul II Chair of Mariology at Franciscan University in Steubenville and Constance Schifflin Blum Chair of Mariology at Ave Maria. He has a Sacred Theology Doctorate from the Angelicum, the Dominican University in Rome. He's the founder and senior editor of Ecce Mater Tua, a journal on Mariology. Ecce Mater Tua just means behold your mother in English. And then he's the president of the International Marian Association. He's a permanent deacon, father of 8. He has a whole ton of books on Mariology for both academics and laity. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to your Amazon author page. Is there any books you'd recommend for, the kind of Catholics you get, the kind of Catholics who go to Mass every Sunday and are sitting in the pews? What books have you written that they might be interested in?
Yeah, well, Father, I would say that there's a book called Meet Your Mother, which is written for both Catholics and non-Catholics because it doesn't presuppose church language, if you will, but it certainly provides the full Catholic teaching on Our Lady. So Meet Your Mother is one I would recommend. And there's also something called Introduction to Mary, which has a little bit more of a Catholic perspective, sources and whatnot. But I think Meet Your Mother is probably your best overall introductory book.
Oh, excellent. Those both sound like pretty good books that I might recommend, to like my family or friends or things like that, right? So for this interview on Lumen Gentium 8, we're going to have 4 main sections, right? We're going to talk first about the kind of focus of Lumen Gentium 8 within Mariology. It's not intended to be a complete Mariology. It might be one of the chapters in those books Dr. Mark just talked about, but it wouldn't be the whole textbook. We're going to do a little history of the document. What I mentioned before about a separate document will be in there. We're going to go and outline the various subchapters, and then we're just going to talk a little bit about John Paul II afterwards, kind of because I like in other interviews I've often done kind of like themes, outline kind of thing, the, outline of each chapter, and then kind of the historical and putting that document in context.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll start with the limited teaching. When I spoke with you setting up this interview, Dr. Mark, you said it was important to note that the council not present a full Marian dogma. Some things not mentioned, like the two dogmas that are defined ex cathedra, the Assumption and the Immaculate Conception. And you specifically noted Lumen Gentium 54, which is, it does not, however, have it in mind to give a complete doctrine on Mary, nor does it wish to decide those questions which the work of theologians has not yet fully clarified. Can you explain the broader context and where this part of Lumen Gentium would fit into that as far as Marian teaching?
Yeah, certainly. So essentially, there were 2 rather strong groups at the Second Vatican Council. One group was called the European Alliance, which was stressing much more ecumenical concerns, that is, concerns for Christian unity. And they were concerned that using traditional titles for Our Lady might be counterproductive for ecumenism. They were also a little bit more concerned about what we call collegiality, that is, bishops working together rather than just an immediate obedience to the Holy Father. And so those tendencies were strong. And the other group, sometimes called the Tiber group, because it was closer to Rome, this would be, Latin America, Italy, Spain, more traditional countries, we're saying, no, let's tell the truth about Our Lady. Let's make sure that we are including the fullness of truth, because that's really what authentic Christian unity dialogue is about, is that we tell the truth and we try to find things that we have in common. So as a compromise, that Lumen Gentium 54, which you just read, it says, look, we don't intend to give a complete doctrine on Mary. Now, that's the only document, Father, where you're going to see that in the Second Vatican Council, where they just come and say, don't consider this a complete document. And so I think that's important as an opening perspective, because people will say, well, I don't see things like mediatrix of all graces in here. I don't see co-redemptrix. And there was actually a line that said, these are absolutely true in themselves, but they've been removed precisely not to cause difficulty with our Protestant brothers and sisters. So the major point is, what's here is true. It's beautiful. It's enriching, but it's not a complete doctrine by the Vatican II Fathers' own admittance.
Oh, yes. And I see in a number of the documents, there is kind of the desire of, especially Paul VI, to try and get like an almost unanimous support for a document, and making some kind of compromise in how he does it. Like on the earlier part of Lumen Gentium about collegiality and things like that. And you got the theological note, which we talked about when I talked to the ecclesiology expert and things like that, right? So, so within that context, what aspects here are emphasized the most about Mary, like her role in the church? What can you say about what is really emphasized in Lumen Gentium within that broader context? So you mentioned the things that weren't emphasized, but what is emphasized?
So yeah, it's really a very good summary of Our Lady in the Old Testament, bringing up Genesis 3:15 and Isaiah 7:14 and Micah 5, which are all references of the prophecy of Mary from the Old Testament in preparation of her reality in the New Testament. And then Our Lady in the New Testament, the major passages, the Annunciation, the Visitation, in many ways following the mysteries of the Rosary. And you also have a very important reference in Lumen Gentium 56, where it says that the fathers of the church did not see Mary as someone passively engaged, but she was actively involved with Jesus in the great work of salvation. So that's a very important point, because you actually had some German theologians in particular in the 1950s saying, well, Mary's role was just a passive role. She just received and distributed graces. And so the council was very clear to say, no, it's not a passive role. It's really an active, free, feminine, personal role at the will of God. But Mary had to say yes, and she did say yes. So it's a beautiful reference of personal dignity, personal freedom, and also that God wanted a woman involved in the great work of salvation. And Mary was precisely that woman.
Excellent. Yeah, I often hear, like, one phrase I'll often hear is that Mary was declared the mother of the church, but I don't find that exact phraseology in Lumen Gentium 8. Is that intention there, or what can you say about Mary's relationship with the church in Lumen Gentium 8?
Right. Well, after we get through, the scripture about Our Lady and the Father's teaching, and then beautiful references of Our Lady's role with Jesus at Calvary at the foot of the cross, and then as a result, her mediation of graces, then it talks about Mary's relationship with the church. But first they have to establish, who is Mary in relation to Jesus? Because that's what's called Christ-centered Mariology. And that's always traditionally what comes first. Then you talk about Mary's relationship with the church. And you're right, Father, it's not in the text. It actually happens on November 21st of 1964, when the text is approved. At that occasion, Paul VI, now St. Paul VI, declares Mary mother of the church. But you're right, it's not, the declaration is not in the text. It's really done by the Pope. Part of the reason for that is that Paul VI asked the bishops to do it several times, and many of the European Alliance bishops didn't want to do it. They wanted Mary to be seen as daughter of the church, but so Paul VI had to do it himself, and he did, because he's the Pope. And so he makes the proclamation that she's mother of the church, and to the great applause, Fulton Sheen said the longest applause in the history of a council was after Paul VI made this tribute to Our Lady, and then for almost 7 or 8 minutes, the bishops were standing applauding Paul VI for his beautiful Marian intervention.
Well, I mean, in Ephesus, they carried the bishops through the streets in a parade. So I don't know if that might be considered a longer applause. So
Yeah,
when
that
they
was just
declared Mary the mother of
outside of
God, for
St.
those
Peter's. Right.
who are not as familiar with the different councils on Mary here, in 431. So a little bit now in the history. As we know, Vatican II had a number of original schemas that were prepared, and some of them came through to the final documents in various degrees and things. The one on Mary was called a dogmatic constitution on the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God and Mother of Men. Can you tell us about that and tell us what parts of it were included in Lumen Gentium and what parts were not?
Yes, and in fact, that schema, which is a Vatican word for a draft, right? That draft was actually written by the Holy Office. Today we call that the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith. So it wasn't just a kind of lightweight draft. It was a draft written by the highest doctrinal commission of the church. Well, again, going back to our early comments, there were many European alliance bishops and theologians who thought, no, it's too traditional, and that's going to upset the Protestants. And that was their fundamental concern. How do we know? Because they kept saying it. Our concern is this could be offensive. The literal line was it could be easily misunderstood by Protestants, and therefore they took out terms like co-redemptrix and mediatrix of all graces from the very draft you're mentioning, from that first draft. It was also intended that it would be its own document. And then the same strong European lines said, no, let's put it in the church so people don't think that Mary's isolated from the church. And many responded by saying, well, she doesn't have to be isolated from the church if you include in the document of the church the role of Mary. And I always find it fascinating to see how Bishop Karol Wojtyła voted on these things, because he wanted, the future John Paul II. He wanted Mary to have her own document. And then he said, if not, make sure she's chapter 2 of the document of the church after chapter 1 on Jesus, so people don't misunderstand this as a denigration, a de-emphasis on Our Lady. And I think, unfortunately, his advice was not followed. Of course, that doesn't mean it's not protected from error, doesn't mean it's not doctrinally sound, but I think a lot could have been saved in terms of unnecessary controversy had they followed the wisdom of Bishop Wojtyła. So that's how it then goes through a series of phases. I mean, there was, well over 10 drafts that ultimately were at least minorly adjusted, some more majorly. And that's what we get at the end of Lumen Gentium 8. But I do want to mention even what many considered was more of a compromise text between ecumenically minded bishops and more traditional bishops still has more on Our Lady than any other ecumenical council. So it still has a real beauty, even though, as they say, it's not a complete document on Mary.
No, excellent. Yeah. And one of the things I mentioned at the beginning is this was one of the close votes. I have in my notes here that it was actually, to put it in Lumen Gentium, it was actually 1,114 in favor, 1,074 against. So that's pretty close to 50-50.
That's right.
Now, beyond what we've already said, is there anything else you want to add about this debate to put it in Lumen Gentium or put it as a separate document that might be valuable for our listeners?
Well, I think in fact, the St. Louis journalists that were there noticed that several council fathers actually came out of that session in tears because they felt that Our Lady had not been honored as tradition had honored her up to that point. And so it was seen, and Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, would later say that this led to a decade without Mary, meaning 10 years after the council, without emphasis on Our Lady. And people thought wrongly that the council officially wanted to downplay the role of Mary. Oh, that's not the case. And it could have been the case of some of the European alliance, but it was not the case of, the overall council. And so I think that, again, as you've already mentioned, that brings us to the wisdom of St. John Paul II, who, right after the council, gives us the authoritative interpretation of Vatican II by saying, that Mary's co-redemptrix, calls her the co-redemptrix 7 times. And just for our listeners, co-redemptrix never means Mary on a level of equality with Jesus. That's heresy, that's blasphemy.
Yeah.
But it means that Mary uniquely participated with Jesus and under Jesus in the great work of the redemption. She's the new Eve. And so John Paul II would then call Mary mediatrix of all grace 8 times when that term was also removed from the first draft. So the point is, with the inspired interpretation of John Paul II, we get back to a real continuity. And I think that's something that Benedict XVI emphasized so much, and that is see Vatican II as a continuity between the past and the future. Don't see it as a rupture, as a break. That's what he calls the hermeneutics of continuity. And I think John Paul II's interpretation brings us more of a complete doctrine on Our Lady as an official interpretation of what was present in the council.
No, excellent. Yeah, I do see that. And one of my things in reading this is that in doing this whole podcast of reading all of the documents of Vatican II is so often there is kind of this spirit of Vatican II that goes directly against the text of the documents. But the unfortunate reality is the documents are pretty extensive, and some of them have a theological language that I wouldn't expect an average person in the pew on Sunday to understand without a little bit of help. That's why I said, hey, why don't I read them, explain them and things. So I think yours fits into the whole reason behind this podcast.
Great.
So now we're just going to move on to the outline of this part of Lumen Gentium, and it has 5 subchapters. And I just want a sentence or a few sentences on each one, so that as we read through them, the listeners know what to expect in the different sections. The first one is just an introduction. What is the context of the introduction there?
Right. Well, the introduction focuses on Galatians 4:4, when in the fullness of time, God sent his son born of a woman. And it's really to say that Mary is to be honored after Jesus, of course, who is divine, is to be honored first within the church. She has a singular privilege because she was the human being called by God to bring us our Redeemer. So the introduction emphasizes that, as well as saying, again, for a third time, this is not a complete document, so people don't expect it to be a complete document. And then in the second section, which is the function of the Blessed Virgin in the plan of salvation, you have, again, Mary in the Old Testament, Mary in the New Testament, Mary by the fathers of the church, especially her role as New Eve. And then, I want to read just this one line because it summarizes that this union between Mary with and at the service of Jesus is why all these other privileges come forward. And it says, this union of the mother with the son in the work of salvation is made manifest from the time of Christ's virginal conception up to his death. And so it's an entire life of Mary serving Jesus in the great plan of redemption. And it will continue with Numbers 58, talking about Mary at the foot of the cross and her suffering and actually consenting to the immolation of the victim. Well, what does that mean? It means Mary said yes to the sacrifice of her son because that was the Father's will. And she knew that that was a requirement for all of us to be her children. So, and then it continues about Mary, her assumption into heaven, her queenship. And that leads to, the third section. And the third section is the Blessed Virgin and the Church. And again, it starts by doing a very good explanation of what's called 1 Timothy 2:5. And that is, there's one mediator. And many Protestant Christians will quote that passage to Catholic Christians saying, no, Mary can't be a mediatrix because there's only one mediator. And the council does a beautiful job of saying Mary's subordinate role does not diminish the one mediation of Jesus at all. It actually manifests its beauty. And then it talks about Mary as a model for the church, that we imitate Our Lady in her virtues, in her prerogatives, and have a proper devotion to her. And then number 4 is the cult of the Blessed Virgin in the church. And it talks about a balance, a proper balance. Avoid two extremes. Too much exaggeration, seeing Mary as if she's a goddess. Well, that hurts Jesus and it hurts Our Lady, and it's blasphemy. The other extreme is too summary an attitude in the words of the Calvinists. That is minimalism, not saying she's a sister, she's a disciple, but she's not our mother. Well, that doesn't serve the truth either. And then finally, at the end, Mary's a sign of hope for the Pilgrim Church. And, Vatican II, as you know, Father, was a council on hope. The documents were very hope-oriented. Vatican I was on faith. Vatican II was on hope. Maybe Vatican III, if it happens, would be on charity. But Vatican II is really on hope, and that Our Lady's victory is a sign of hope for all of us. So, and it ends on an ecumenical note, asking Our Lady to unite all Christians together. So it's really a beautiful structure.
Thank you, Dr. Milavalle. Yeah, I was going to give you the 5 points, but you went through them all, so I don't need to do that. You also kind of hinted at our last point here, our last subtopic, which is really John Paul II, and he really helped bring the fullness of the doctrine from Vatican II. The first thing I think of when I think of John Paul II and Mariology is Redemptoris Mater, his encyclical, mother, which just means Mother of the Redeemer in Latin. And what can you say about that encyclical and what he teaches about Mary in that encyclical?
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring that up, Father, because it really, when we were talking about the battle at Vatican II, John Paul just removes the battle dimension. Because the structure of Mother of the Redeemer is chapter 1, Mary and the mystery of Christ. Beautiful. That's where we should start. Christ-centered Mariology. Who is Mary in relation to Jesus? Then chapter 2 is Mary in relation to the church. Also beautiful, as long as that's subordinate to chapter 1. In other words, as long as we don't think Mary's just one of us. I don't know about you, but I didn't wake up today thinking I was immaculately conceived or the mother of God or the queen of heaven and earth, and hope none of our listeners do. And so she is she is one of the church, but she's beyond that. She's mother of the church. And that's his second section. And then chapter 3 is maternal mediation. And so he really doubles down on Mary's unique role as our spiritual mother, as the mediatrix from whom all graces come, as our advocate and our queen. So it's really a beautiful completion, we could say, of what the council talks about, at least in terms of bringing up those titles and doctrines they hesitated to. And John Paul did what's truly Marian and what's truly ecumenical. He brings them up and then he explains them, and they're beautiful.
Excellent. Yeah. Is there any other documents you think of John Paul II that are important to mention here for his Mariology?
Well, I'd say Rosarium Virgini Mariae, which is Rosary of the Virgin Mary in 2002, is just a beautiful document. And it's really John Paul calling us. And he ends by saying, I call all bishops, priests, deacons to preach the rosary with conviction. I strongly recommend family members. It's not a difficult read, like the council would be, to read the beauty, the history, the efficacy of the rosary. So I would end with recommending that document as well.
Oh yeah, no, definitely, and that's the document that introduced the luminous mysteries to the whole church, because it was before just it was kind of a local custom in certain places before that, and that really introduced the whole church. Anyway, so thanks for being here. We're going to have a link to your Amazon author page in the show notes. Is there anything else that you might want to share with our listeners that they can read from you, listen to you, watch you lecture, or anything like that?
Well, on a website called motherofallpeoples.com, I do a weekly commentary called Mary Live, which tries to give a commentary on, contemporary events, but through a Marian lens. Then I also have for those who want a little bit more meat, if they're interested in a little bit more theology, I have something called a masterclass in Mariology, which is also on Mary Live. I do that with Dr. Robert Fastigi. We do kind of a master's or a doctoral level course on that for those who are interested. But I would say, most of all, let's make sure that we're obeying Jesus when he says, "Behold your mother."
Oh yeah, definitely. When I had Dr. Fastigi on, I think he mentioned the Mariology class he did with you, if I remember correctly. So, anyways, because I had him on for the history of councils, because he is he knows he's like a walking encyclopedia of church history and the councils. I remember when I was in a class with him, and we went a little bit off topic, and he said, "Oh, I think that's in in Denziger, about this number." And so somebody opens up, and he was off by one number, and this random other teaching that wasn't the theme, because it was a seminar class, so it wasn't the theme of the seminar for that day. So, because I had him for my license class there in Detroit. Anyways, thank you all for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can help StarQuest produce it, another great podcast, at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time, monthly, or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow we're going to start reading this Lumen Gentium 8 with paragraphs 52 to 54, which is chapter 1, and it really explains Mary's role. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information like playlists and a reading plan, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook or X.
Amen.